Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started. After a terrific morning, we have a great lineup for this afternoon. And our next panel is Formulating Policy for Defeating Putinism. And moderating this session is my old friend and from Chatham House, James Nixey. James, over to you, and panel, please take your positions.
Right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you are full in stomach and about a third full in mind, as we're about a third of the way through. David, you've given us 55 minutes to look at formulating a policy for defeating Putinism. Thank you very much for that. It's even right here, the whole session. Fortunately, I've got the best possible panel equipped to deal with that, so thank you for that, at least. We have Ed Chow from CSIS, Igor Munteanu from Chisinau and the Coalition for Unity and Prosperity, my old friend Bruno Tertrais from the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, and Viola von Cramon, an MEP for, I think, the Green Party in Germany, in the EU. So, we have an American, a Moldovan, French, and German. Sounds like a bad joke. Nobody has volunteered to go first, I have to say. But listen, to be serious for a second, then, it does seem to me that those three letters at the end of the horrible word Putin there are really pretty important to this, and it's obviously not a mistake that Nino and David put it there. It's probably hard. I think it's probably harder to defeat Putinism than to defeat Putin. You can argue that point, and maybe we will. I know Bruno's going to try and define it in a French intellectual way, he said just now. But I suppose you an obvious point, if you'll excuse me for a second, is you cannot possibly defeat Putinism without defeating Putin. Right, that's obviously clear. I suppose it is possible, at least I can intellectualize it, that it's possible that Putinism will depart with the defeat of Putin, but not necessarily. Stalinism did more or less die out with Stalin, so there is precedent for that. I would argue, for what it's worth, and I hope we'll get into this, that it will depend upon the manner of Putin's departure, be it violent or more or less orderly. Either way, I would offer, controversial perhaps, that whoever comes after Putin is unlikely to be worse. It's hard for me to envisage anything much worse, but maybe, again, you can take me on that, you four, or anybody in the audience. So anyway, let's stick to the implications of the question and see if we can formulate together this policy and sort of operationalize it, I suppose, make it as practical as we can. And so I'm just going to pick on somebody as nobody. Well, in fact, I will pick on Bruno because you said you just say on the grass there that you were going to start out by defining Putinism to us, and maybe you can riff off what I've just said, and I'll get back to everybody else.
I don't know. I don't know if I can define it, but there's two things that came to mind when I was asked to speak on this panel. Well, first of all, indeed, as a so-called French intellectual, I have to conceptualize. But one, defeating Putinism for me goes beyond what the stated U.S. agenda and Western agenda of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia is. Okay, so what we're talking about is going beyond that. So I remember that I had a book in my bookshelf, and
Is he gone?
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry, I shouldn't move that much. Walter Laqueur published a book 6 years ago called Putinism. So I dusted off the book and said, oh, I hope he has a definition of Putinism. Yeah. And unfortunately, he does not really define it. It's a mix of nationalism, anti-Westernism, what he calls zapadophobia, which I thought is a great name, and cult of the personality. So it's a pretty obvious definition. But what we agree on, James, you mentioned it, is that defeating Putin or having Putin disappear from the scene does not make Putinism disappear. That's for sure. The other point I want to make to start with is that I think that we should not see Putinism as a policy, but as something, a mental thing, something which is in the heads of Russians, but also in our own heads. I mean, in my own country and in some other Western European countries, Putinism is deeply ingrained in the mind. The idea that Russia needs a strong man, that Russia needs a sphere of influence, that Russia is a great European power. And these ideas have been deeply ingrained in French and German psyche and other countries perhaps for a long time. So the fact that, if we are talking about going beyond the person of Putin, going beyond the policies followed by Putin for the past 20 years, are we talking about ending Russian imperialism?
Yeah.
Is that what we're talking about? If so, that's an even more ambitious agenda. So I have possible answers, or at least recommendations, but I think that would be for the second part of the roundtable, right?
I can. To be honest with you, if you have how many do you have?
Okay.
How many do you have? Please, you're on a roll.
At least 2 or 3,
Good.
okay? So first of all, I think we should not be, and when I say we, once again, I'm talking from a Western European standpoint, we should be under no illusions that the departure of Putin would solve magically the problem we have with Russia. It sounds like a simple thing, but it's not that much, it's not that simple. 2, if you want to affect Putinism in the heads, in the minds, the mindset, I mean, continuing to deal with the way Russia influences our media and our politics will remain absolutely fundamental. There's a country we were talking about during dinner yesterday, a southern European country, a sister country of France, as they say sometimes, which is, so deeply poisoned by Russian influence in the media and politics that I sometimes think that we don't have it so bad in France. But I mean, and I'm talking about Italy clearly, but Italy.
I thought Germany.
Well, no, okay. Yeah, I'll let you talk about Germany, but that's something which will not be over with the disappearance of Putin, obviously. And then maybe more importantly, and that's really the point I would like to make here, is that I like to deal with the question of Putinism as an illness, okay? And if you are facing a country which is ill, you have, broadly speaking, 4 options. And I don't know which options we should have, but I think that the 4 following options are what we will need to consider as Europeans and Westerners. 1, you draw a cordon sanitaire. Well, that expression has some weird resonance. Maybe I should, but isolation wall. Build a virtual wall or maybe a real wall and wait for Russia to heal if it can. That may last decades if it ever happens. Second option, help Russia cure itself. Develop, produce, assist so that it produces antibodies, so to say. Third option is, serious treatment, maybe experimental treatment, foster active change in Russia. Is that what we want? I don't know, but I mean, this is the third option, so to say. And the fourth option is amputation.
Yeah.
And amputation means actually actively supporting the disintegration of the empire. Again, I'm not saying that I favor one option over the other, but I think the image of the illness, of the sickness of Russia is a good mental framework to deal with the various options that we have for the next, 5, 10, 20 years. It's a long game so that we can at least attempt to defeat Putinism.
That's great, Bruno. That makes a lot of sense, I think, to all of us. Igor, let me come to you.
Yes.
Can you obviously riff off of what Bruno was saying, but I mean, in defeating Putinism, I mean, I suppose it's as Bruno was saying, it does mean making Russia less aggressive and Russians less imperialistically minded. That does strike me as a pretty hard task.
Well, it's very good to start by defining exactly the term, what is Putinism and what is not. The Putinism as an wartime ideology is based on 2 main major ideas. First of all is that Putinists believe that Russia is a civilization in itself, cut off or decoupled, isolated from the rest of the world. And therefore, they preserve their authenticity by fighting the West, fighting the others. So it's a sort of xenophobic ideology. The second element of this ideology of Putinism is that they are based on conservative values. So they reject everything that is modernizing the society. So this is exactly an wartime ideology, which is anti-Western, it is anti-civilizational. Depending on our stomach, may call it with elements of the fascist state, because what they are doing in Ukraine, committing war crimes every day, is a fascist state. How can we cure, as our colleagues have collected? Only through dissemination of liberal ideas, only by creating consensus on what is acceptable to the normal, let's say, norms, to the norms of cohabitation in the modern world, and what is not. And I think that in this particular case, we have to apply a kind of radical solidarity concept. What is radical solidarity? It is something that nobody from the collective West and something that we belong to should not have separate deals with Putin Russia, should not free ride, should not create concessions or impose concessions or compromises with a country, with a state that is killing its dissidents, is killing its politicians, is shutting up voices of the opposition, and is, let's say, creating an atmosphere of fear and let's say, evil. But we have to be careful, because 72% of the population in Russia, they endorse Putin today. And what we saw in the past, it was a kind of Crimea consensus. What does it mean? That population in Russia believe that what Putin is doing is normal and is good for imperial reasons, for imperial goals. Yeah. What has started in 2014, 2015 was the creation of a Donbass consensus, endorsement for the war. So Putin believes that he got a mandate from his fellows, citizens. Those who neglected or those who rejected this kind of wartime Putinism ideology have been decimated, killed, or extradited from the country. So the task to defeat Putinism is a complicated one, but not an impossible one. Again and again, I will repeat, we need a strategy and a plan. I call it radical solidarity. And this will help us very much in creating the platform for defeating ideology. We should not underestimate the importance of the ideology in this war with Russia, because the largest component of the offensive of the Russians against the West is ideology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Igor. Viola, let me turn to you. Feel free to continue to define Putinism and talk about the problem we have not just with Putin himself, but with Russians, as implied by the question. But I also have a specific question for you as well, to add on to it, or instead of, as you prefer, bearing in mind where you work. Because it does seem to me that multilateral organizations have failed in terms of formulating policies. Most recently, Vilnius, it does seem to have been a failure, at the very least a disappointment. But on the other hand, I suppose the G7 has come out with something much stronger in terms of commitment to security guarantees, or security commitments, I should say, not so much guarantees, security commitments. So I guess what my question is to you is any kind of multilateral organization, including where you work, I mean, how do you, they seem to have come up short. We know the weaknesses of the UN, we know the weaknesses of the OSCE. Where can they make a real substantive on-the-ground policy formulation difference?
Well, I would say, at least for the majority of my colleagues in the European Parliament, we are pretty clear what is necessary to do. So it was never the case that the European Parliament has blocked anything when it comes to the support of Ukraine and even to fight Putinism. I think for the moment, I wouldn't say when you compare multilateral institutions and put the European Parliament in the same pot, I would say actually we are doing pretty good. And this is what Linus has said before. Actually, we were much more united than Putin had hoped for and that he had expected. So in that case, I think we can always improve. We are not swift enough, we are not decisive enough, the amount of ammunition we have produced and so on, the capacities are not big enough, and. All the details fully clear, we have to become much better, but in general, I think all of us, and I include also the Council and the Commission, are very much committed to what is necessary to win this war against and to fight then the Putinism. But I'm much more concerned, since I'm from Germany and I have traveled to the east of Germany quite a lot during the last month. What we need to do is build up, and not just in Germany, but in all of the countries, a strategic communication why we do this and why defeating Putinism also matters for our democratic institution in the European Union. And I don't think we have done this enough. I think the pressure from the so-called ordinary people, I've heard Sweden is different, that's great, but I know that Italy, Germany, France, some other countries, there it is sometimes rather difficult to explain to ordinary people why Putin is a threat to all of us every day. And so we need to explain what Putinism means. Right. It's an ultra-nationalistic concept. While he says he's respecting minorities, at the same time he's sending the minorities as cannon fodder to the front line in Ukraine. We see that the KGB, the FSB, is actually the ruling party. It's in the hand of the kleptocratic Siloviki in Russia, and we see the consequences, how this mafia state is being ruled. And I see that also in some capitals, we had some interesting conversation on that yesterday, be it Washington, be it Berlin, be it others, there's a big fear of any kind of instability. And I'm worried that the so-called concept of stability is one of the main concern for many of us to go forward. I'm not afraid of any of this so-called nuclear threat coming from Moscow. This is really nothing which should worry us. We should be much more self-confident. We should get prepared. We should also prepare our society that this kind of rhetorical threat coming from Moscow is a rhetorical threat. And that is part of this hybrid warfare. This is part of the communication from Moscow, where they are being taught, these KGB guys, for years. They are experts. They are masters on this. We need to make sure that our society is not scared and puts pressure on our politician, and then they say, well, maybe we don't escalate, we don't do this, we don't do this. And that is, I think, we have not been strong enough. So no reset button at the moment, no naivety, think about how to get prepared in case it will fall apart, the Russian Empire. Get prepared, as we have heard before. Try to build up alliance with those people who have left Russia. Try to make sure we have alternatives and go through the different scenarios instead of thinking, oh, stability is the overall concept we have to adhere to. And this is, I think, we have not done enough to explain why this Putinism matters for all of us and why this threat we need to get rid of.
Viola, I think you've really hit on something there in terms of we've failed to explain what Putinism really means. We're doing it now, but maybe to people who aren't as fully immersed in this as everybody is in this courtyard. But I guess the problem I have when I'm trying to explain it is not sounding... of course, I'm sure everyone in this courtyard has been accused of being a Cold War warrior at some point, probably multiple times. But because if you begin to invoke fascism or Hitler or talk about imperialism even, or neo-imperialism, then people seem to switch off. So I guess the problem I have is in explaining Putinism, and yet without getting people to think, oh, it's just another, I was saying this to Žygimantas Pavilionis last night, if he's there, just another Eastern European, bias. And so I guess, I don't know, I was asking this question of Zhigi, how do we get beyond having acknowledged that the Baltic states were right all along, actually listening to the advice, which is effectively what you're espousing here?
Well, I think we need a trickle-down effect. So if, for example, our chancellor in Germany would take over ownership for what's necessary to do and really explain to our people at least once why we are sending the weapons and why this is crucial for us that we win the war together, and then have political education on different levels, try to reach out to teachers, to other multiplicators, try to reach out to our societies. We have never done this systematically. Yes, some journalists do this, But I mean, the bigger newspapers, the opinion makers is not really something which reaches out then to ordinary citizens in large. So I think we need a strategic communication much more. I think we need to have a commitment, not just by my very highly appreciated Baltic colleagues, but by all of the 27 head of states. And that needs to be continued. This needs to be filled with content, explaining money, military support. And actually, I'm very optimistic that people understand what is on stake and why, for example, also the next European elections, people have to make a decision what they are standing for, democracy or dictatorship,
right.
autocracy or abolishing democracy and stuff like this. And this needs to be explained in very simple terms, and I think we are ready to do so.
That's really interesting. I'm not as optimistic as you are, people will understand, but we'll come back to it. Excellent. Last but not least, Ed, I don't want to pigeonhole you as an energy expert, and you're very welcome, of course, to talk about Putinism, Putin, the Russian people, but I am going to ask you an energy and economics question to start off with, and you can do either.
Well, I think
that's interesting. Okay, so it would seem that at least a part of defeating Putinism has got to be, to use Bruno's medical analogy, whether it's amputation or some form of restrictive measure, whether that be abolishing or removing its ability to be any kind of energy superpower whatsoever, if it ever was. You can pick on that one. And obviously the sanctions question, whether it's sanctioning back to the Stone Age, to use that term, or whether it's getting to a sort of a net zero trade with Russia. We've done a lot. It seems to me we've done an unimaginable amount in the non-war context, but not nearly enough in the war context. So my very, very obvious question to you is what more is there to do to get to a position where we would be, adhering to that title?
Thank you very much, James, and thank you for keeping your promise last night that I won't have to speak first and embarrass myself. Those of you who know me knows my background is economics and business and more the energy business than anything else. And, you might ask why I'm on this panel. I ask myself the same question. And at the risk of never being invited to this program conference ever again, Nino, I'm going to make a couple of observations somewhat outside of my lane, and then I will return to your question, James. No one have ever accused me of over-intellectualizing anything. But for me, as a layperson among experts on Russia and the region as a whole, I think elevating Putin to Putinism is elevating it to a level it does not deserve.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
We're not talking about international communism here, trying to spread this ideology around the world. What I see, again, as a layman, amateur, is naked aggression, conquests for territory, conducted with wanton brutality. And as every schoolboy knows, how do you deal with a bully on the schoolyard?
Yeah.
You punch him in the nose. That's what you do with the bully. And to say that it is some kind of ism may or may not be deserving.
Right.
The second question, observation I would make, may be related to the first only in my mind, is the West need to recognize that we're moving into a multipolar world. And it's about China, but not only China. And as much as we value human rights, democracy, rule of law, civil liberties, there are also other state interests. Territorial integrity, economic prosperity, food security, energy security, whatever. And if we are to persuade those countries that we see today as neutral and therefore allowing Russia to do what it's doing, we have to persuade them with more nuanced diplomacy than we're currently doing. That we have to frame it in terms of their interests and not of our interests.
Yeah.
And this is the world that we're moving into, and we should recognize that. On sanctions, as a business person, I've never been a particular fan of sanctions.
Okay.
But war is different. Wartime is different. And what I would say about economic sanctions is that if you're going to do it, you have to do it with overwhelming force.
Right.
And not ratchet it up gradually to a point where your adversary get used to it, do workarounds, and adjust, and given time to adjust. And we're in here, getting back to something I do know something about. It's dangerous to think that we can fine-tune this. There is some kind of technocratic middle ground that allows us to sanction Russia on energy, but somehow our gasoline prices won't go up. That this is a mistake. And what are the facts? The facts are that Russia got more oil and gas income in the year 2022 than it did in 2021. That's the facts. Because oil and gas prices jumped up, and the notion of putting a price cap on oil actually diluted the impact of European embargo. Because European companies, shipping companies, insurance companies, continues to service Russian exports of oil. And so, prices have come down. Mm-hmm. Some of the advocates of the price cap have pat themselves on the shoulder, saying that it's been a success. But they set a price cap that was so high that it had practically no effect on Russian oil. And once the market realized that the West was not serious, oil prices came down at the beginning of this year. And that was the time when Western officials should have ratcheted down the sanctions from $60 to some other number like 45 or something like that, if they're serious. And so we are lacking in tight enforcement of the sanctions. Yeah. It's based on some expectations of a buyer saying that I bought it for less than $60. No one has, in the Western governments, have the capacity to check whether that's even true or not. And we have officials, at least in my government, openly talking about soft enforcement of the cap. So we need to do a lot more in tightening the price cap. We need to do more on ratcheting down the price. After all, oil and gas represented more than 50% or around half of Russian central government revenue, 2/3 of export earnings. We could have done a lot more at some pain to ourselves. But this, if we think of this as a crisis, then particularly in America, Europeans are already paying very high energy prices. I think we need to recognize the consequences. So, and there are additional sanctions that we can and should be putting on Russia. No LNG sanctions, for example. With the startup of Arctic 2 project, the fourth quarter of this year, Russia would be the fourth largest LNG producer, exporter in the world, and Europe continues to buy Russian LNG, and so does Japan and Korea and other countries that are supposedly our partners in the sanctions regime. So, there's always this talk about Russia is going to weaponize oil and gas. Well, they tried to do that.
Yeah, we've done
And the threat is much worse than the bite, actually. And once you've used it, it's gone. You can't keep using it. So dare the Russians to lower their production and their exports if they don't like the ever-tightening oil and gas sanctions that we're going to impose on them.
That's good to know, and it's good to know that there's much more we can do if we have the political will, spine to do so. But just while I've got you, one quick follow-up question. It's probably fair to say that we overestimated the Russian army, but we've perhaps underestimated its economy. In other words, I mean, to me, it's slightly surprising. It's almost impressive, loath as I am to say it, that the Russians have been able to prosecute this war as much as they have, bearing in mind all that we have done unto them. So do you think the Russian economy is, not endlessly resilient, of course, and we've seen the ruble fall lately, but, I mean, based upon what you've just said, I mean, I know everyone asks the question, how much longer can Russia go on for? But, I mean, I guess I am asking that question, bearing in mind all that we're doing and I know it's a question of how much we could do, and it's dependent upon what we will do. But, I mean, do you think there's any basis of that the Russian economy, because it's turned itself into a war economy lately, that it can keep up, obviously at the expense of its people, because he doesn't care about his people, can keep pushing along for some time to come? I mean, I think one general I was reading this morning, I can't remember who it was, said that this is definitely going into 2025, as in the Russians are definitely capable of sustaining until then. Economically speaking, would you agree with that?
I never thought the sanctions by themselves would push Russia to its knees. Sanctions have to be coupled with a political strategy, with military force in a situation of war. So by itself was never going to do it. How long did Saddam Hussein last under UN sanctions? It looked like he was going to last forever until the U.S. intervened militarily. How long has Maduro lasted in Venezuela under U.S. sanctions? Iran could be another example. To think that Russia will climb down or admit defeat only because of our sanctions is to believe that they have the same values we have.
Right.
And clearly that's not true, and their political system is not the same as ours. So I think it's dangerous to project what we would do onto what the Russian government might do.
Right, thank you. Bruno, back to you. I see you've overcome your technical problems, I hope. Let me ask you this. Do you believe that defeating Putinism necessarily implies humiliation for Putin, for Russia?
First of all, can I say a quick word about
Absolutely.
sanction? On sanction, I don't recall that any of our country thought that the mere imposition of sanction would be enough to stop the war.
True.
But I think it's always interesting to remember that we failed to deter Russia because we tried to deter Russia through the threat of sanctions. Massive sanctions. That was September 2021, massive sanctions. I think that was the wording of the G7. We failed to deter sanctions. And I think there is a political symbol about sanctions, show that the crime does not pay, etc. There is a reputation effect, what lessons we draw for China, there's the whole debate about sanctions does not end with the fact that indeed, as you said, sanctions have not had the impact on the economy that some of us hoped it would have. On your question, James, I'm sorry, I got the answer, but I'm not sure I remember the question.
It was about humiliation.
Yeah, I got it, sorry. No, I was not, this was not joking.
You got the question.
Yeah. I think precisely you have to make a difference between the two.
Right.
Some countries, my own has been and I think Germany too, have been obsessed with the idea that, oh, you should not humiliate Russia because, one, you do not humiliate a great European power because otherwise, 20 years later, you get, fascism, Nazism, and all that, which is historically reinterpreting history, as we all know, because, the Keynesian interpretation of the Versailles Treaty is something that too easily imposes us, narrative. And two, you can't humiliate a nuclear power. Hey, I can give you the list of humiliations that nuclear powers have suffered since 1945. Yeah. However, I think it's maybe Russia needs to be humiliated, but certainly Putin needs to be humiliated. Right. So that would be the short answer to your question. On the nuclear element, by the way, I think just for the sake of the debate, I'm 100% with you on the excesses of our love for diplomats' love for stability, etc. Especially when there's a nuclear element. And make no mistake, we will find the same debate as the one we had in 1990 will happen in a few years from now. With the James Baker on the one hand and with the Dick Cheney on the other. So that will be the same debate. However, I still think that as overblown as the nuclear threat is, and I do think it's way overblown, if you're sitting in the White House or in the Elysee, you have your responsibility is also to see it as something that you can't just, put aside. I mean, when we put ourselves in the shoes of head of nuclear powers, it's difficult to. I think it's difficult. So I have some sympathy for the Bidens and Macrons of this world on that particular point, even though I keep telling them, as many of us, hey, I think this is just for show. There's no real nuclear threat. So anyway, I think that's it. I have the point to make about fascism also.
Sure, hit it.
The expression fascism, I suspect that because it has been overused in European debates of the past 6 decades, we can't even recognize fascism when it really happens. Mm-hmm. All right? So we were having a conversation with some French colleagues earlier on about, is Russia a fascist state, proto-fascist, quasi-fascist, etc. But, that conversation is something which is difficult to have sometimes in Western Europe, because anytime you say fascism, crying wolf, etc. Even though I think it's a real thing. So Godwin point, did you say Godwin point in the UK? It was that expression. I'm actually for the temporary rehabilitation of the Godwin point. Yes, the referendum in Crimea was like the Sudetenland, etc. So I think we have a problem with recognizing fascism. Some of us in Western Europe have a problem with saying fascism when it really raises its head. Am I making sense?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
No, absolutely. I mean, I would not object that, but maybe if I can react to the question of how to counter this nuclear rhetorics. Because, I mean, you started with, we have to deal with a bully. And if I were in the White House or even in the Elysee and I would control nuclear weapons, I would definitely tell this guy in Moscow, if you use that, there will be not a full hour until we get you. This is sorry that I'm so hawkish, but this would be the appropriate. This would be the appropriate reply instead of saying, well, we shouldn't escalate because and this even encourages him to go further and further and further because he has the imagination there is no red line. And so, yes, of course, you have to be responsible as a politician. You shouldn't talk openly about this, but the backdoor talks should be explicitly about this and should make sure there is not we would not even dare to think not to use this, and that must be crystal clear for that guy in Moscow. Okay. Yep. And maybe regarding the sanctions, I mean, yes, there is a huge percentage of circumventing sanction coming back from Kazbegi. We have seen all the trucks and reading the The statistics, Kyrgyzstan has increased export of 773% with, I don't know, the EU or Germany or whatsoever. So everything which can be used, the Russians do use. But when it comes to technology and high technology, they are lacking the spare part. And this is a long-term development we should really count on. This might be not effective in a short term, but the long term will work, and I definitely count on this.
Concrete point,
Yeah.
thank you, noted. Absolutely very useful for the specific title of the panel. I must turn to questions, but I've been neglecting Igor, so forgive me, David, as I give Igor one more hopefully spicy question. Igor, I said at the start that perhaps the longevity of Putinism may depend upon the manner of his departure from the presidency. So, here's the question. What would be the best manner of his departure from the presidency?
Well, Putin himself is an expression of the system he represents, which means that he will stay in power as long as the system will be happy with the ideology of Putinism, which is, in fact, an alternative to jingoism, a patriotic call to war and to expansion. I think that today, of course, there are several fractures inside of the Russian society, particularly with the fact that many bright and talented Russians have emigrated. Some of the important oligarchs, like Aven, like Friedman, they are Abramovich, they are contesting directly. They're saying the war is a crazy thing, or the war is a nightmare, whatever. And even Abramovich attempted to mediate a kind of break in this war. But what has to be said is that we have to call the spade a spade. Putin is a criminal, and it should not be left any kind of space where somebody would imagine that he or she can deal with Putin. And this is something that has to consolidate the community of democracies and community of people which respect the rule of law environments. Speaking about the sanctions, I think largely, Ambassador...
Just very, very short.
Yeah. Ambassador Fried is the specialist in the sanctions policies. But I would say that largely the sanctions policy was a success because it deterred Russia from technologies, from strategical investments. It did not have enough success in the financial field, but nevertheless, Russia lost its soft power in Central and Eastern Europe. Nobody would side, with some exceptions, with Putin and this kind of criminal war. And I think that we have to expand the area of people which are under sanctions list. And I mean the members of the families of oligarchs, members of the families of those who align with Putin, members of the families of those who stand for power in Russia. And this is exactly what we need as the next wave of development.
Okay, one of the things I take from that very interesting point, Igor, is that Putin is a criminal and we should accept it as such. And I do remember him saying once upon a time, I think it was about Khodorkovsky, somebody else may correct me, but a thief belongs in jail. So what does a genocidal maniac belong, I suppose? Right, I am probably a little over time. No, we've got 10 minutes for questions. It's really quite hard to see here because we're in the sun, so please be super animated. So Dan Fried, since we've questions right there in the yellow tie, middle, front.
Sanctions and the context of Putinism. The bad news is sanctions are always going to be leaky. There will always be accurate press stories about circumvention of sanctions. The good news is the sanctions don't have to work 100% to be effective.
Absolutely.
The sanctions against the Soviet Union were just awful. The Europeans and Americans quarreled all the time. They were full of holes. The literature at the time was certain that they were an abject failure. And ask yourselves how the Soviet economy did in the 1980s. They were a tactical failure, a political disaster, and a strategic success. Now, the sanctions this time are not going to get Putin out of Ukraine. At least the timing is wrong. To affect the battlefield, send more weapons. And this has been, ask General Ben Hodges about this.
Yeah.
But the sanctions are causing a longer-term and mid-term deterioration of the Russian economy because they deny Putinism the ability to circumvent its own inefficient character, just like the Soviet economy, through loans, credits, and technology. So push pedal to the metal on sanctions, and the specific, the specific suggestions about the energy sanctions, I generally agree with, especially on the enforcement side. I think that's where the U.S. and the EU are headed.
Thanks, Dan. Can I just add to that, Ed, before I offer you to riff off of that? But then can I just, if we had done in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, what we did in 2022, February, would we be where we are now? I mean, we obviously wouldn't entirely, but I mean, sort of based upon Dan's comments.
Well, certainly if we had reacted more robustly across all fronts after 2014,
particularly sanctions,
that might have had a deterrent effect on what happened in 2022. I have to admit,
but the constraining point,
that
Dan's constraining point,
the fact that Putin threw away the energy card so cavalierly, in a manner that suggests that he thought that the Europeans will essentially be blackmailed to accepting, was a miscalculation on his part, but as an expert, it was also something that I underestimated that Putin would do.
Great. Next, please.
Thanks for the insightful discussion. My name is Maria Liadze from the Margaret Thatcher Center of Georgia. And I think that we can all agree that today, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the United States and Europe are more or less united in calling a spade a spade. But when speaking about defeating Putinism, you have laid out some interesting formulas like isolation, amputation, so on and so forth. But I think there was something missing. I felt that when you want to defeat Putinism, you have to hold Russia accountable. Not only Putin, but all those top-ranking and low-ranking officials who are involved into the war crimes and atrocities. So my question is, do you actually believe that it is possible to defeat Putinism without holding Russia accountable, just like fascist Germany during the Nuremberg trials after the World War II? Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very good point, ma'am. And I think it's something we've missed. So who wants to...
I think the question was addressed at least partly to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I would say, first of all, my formulas were not recipe to defeat Putinism, but just 4 separate strategies to deal partly with the problem of Putinism. In answer to your question, I think it's a tough one because, one, you do have to hold Russia, not only Putin, but Russia accountable. It's a moral imperative. We owe it to the Ukrainians, we owe it to ourselves. However, I'm not sure that this has an immediate deterrent value on the regime itself and on future regimes. The way authoritarian regimes and fascist regimes operate do not necessarily make them amenable to that kind of threat. We've seen that before, we've seen that in the past. It can actually, radicalize some of that because they have nothing to lose, etc. Don't get me wrong. I still think it's the right thing to do. We need it, we own it, we owe it to the Ukrainians, etc. So that's a long way to say we have to do it. That's part of defeating Putinism, but that's not a critical component in itself. We have to do it, but it's not critical.
As well. Hello, I'm back again. Okay, I think it's a really good point that there are some actions which do, and it's true for the economic sphere as well, which seem to have unintended consequences, and yet in spite of those unintended consequences, we should probably do them anyway. Right, okay, Brian.
Yeah, Brian Whitmore, Atlantic Council. Thanks, James, and thanks for an excellent panel. There's just one component that I think has been missing, and that component is us, the West. Putinism has risen kind of concomitant with a decline in confidence on both sides of the Atlantic in our own model and our own system. And my question is, how important is regaining confidence in our model, our system, our institutions, our story in defeating Putinism? Thank you.
Well, absolutely right. I mean, we have to do our homework, and at least in the European Union, we try to do our best, speaking about the enlargement process, speaking about conditionality, speaking about what you have said before, rule of law, and so on and so forth. So strengthening our institution is one precondition that, I mean, what Putin fears most is a functional democracy in his neighborhood, amongst a Slavic brother state, as he is called it. And to make this happen would be the biggest threat for his power, that's for sure. But I mean, we have failed in the past. We see the Hungarian example. We let it go. And even with Poland, to be honest, we have a lot of questions, and we were much too laissez-faire, so to say. But in general, I would say that we kept at least the idea of functioning institution in the European Union and in other multilateral institutions uphold.
I'm pleased you have the faith that perhaps the question implies that we don't necessarily always have in ourselves. But I do agree with your very original point, Viola, that actually the EU has come out of this relatively well by comparison, I have to say. Final question, please. So, yeah, gentlemen, sort of center back. Yeah, right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hiro Akita from Tokyo. My question is about how to assess the risk when the empire started to decline. Because when we look back the history, when empire become more assertive as it rises as great power, but empire tend to behave more unpredictably or irrationally as they started to decline. So my question is, what is a nightmare scenario for when Russia started to dismantle or decline?
Got it. Thank you very much. The risks of the decline of an empire like Russia, and I think it comes back to one of Viola's earlier points about us fetishizing stability as well. But having just spoken, I'll go to Igor and maybe Bruno to finish with.
It's a misleading term of stability in Russia. Nothing is stable over there. There are power games everywhere between security services and the regional leaders. There are important losses and harms to the populations at the periphery, not exactly in the big cities. So today, of course, there are many people are calculating exactly what they are getting out of this war. And therefore, the standing of Putin in polls is very volatile. The declining of an empire brings a lot of consequences. Fragmentation, uncertainties, civil wars, whatever. But these are less evils than exactly the critical mass of genocide that we see today in Ukraine. And genocide that can be replicated everywhere at the neighborhoods of Russia. Therefore, we from Moldova, because I have to say some words about Moldova, we are very happy to be part, to transit from a neighborhood policy to an enlargement policy. We are very happy to have 9 conditionalities to be met. We have a plan. We have to be part of the European Union. And there is a strong incentive to make outstanding reforms and to have more consolidated society based on the fact that there is only one shot to be done. Unfortunately, there is a large problem with, let's say, splits in the society. But the promise at the end of the tunnel is that we are going to be part of the West, of the European Union. And this is quite, how to say, an appealing invitation to us.
Thank you. Viola is looking at me pleadingly.
No, just one sentence on Moldova.
Yeah,
if you want to see a role model on enlargement, go to Moldova, speak to the politicians, speak to their representatives. I mean, we were really impressed what they have done during the war, not just reforms, but also bring resilience to the country, to the society. Wow, I mean, Moldova, first, I mean, it was Georgia, then it was Ukraine, I would say now it's definitely Moldova. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gents, yeah, the big cheese over here is telling me to wrap up, and I know Kurt Volker and NATO are on next. You don't want to miss that. Let me just say that in terms of defeating Putinism, but somebody once said that if you want to predict the future, then you need to invent it. So it is very much down to us. The Ukrainians, I know, can do it. It's whether we can as well, going back to one of Brian's questions, perhaps. That's it. Please join me in thanking the very probably hot under the sun panel.